again, this idea that we're crippled by the fear of what if. What if I'm a failure? What if I lose that person? What if I lose that client? It's again going back to this idea of like not celebrating positive moments when they happen, because I'm already in the future, because maybe I remember losing a client in the past. There's just so much going on where we're doing this back and forth business, and not actually thinking, right, well, what's the issue at hand right now, and how can I deal with that? But conversely, how can I look after myself?
So, welcome to this episode of Exploring Emotional Overdraft with me, Andy Brown. And today I am really, really delighted to have, I'm going to say it's an old chum of mine, really. I mean, we worked together as a client and advisor, but feel like kindred spirits. We connected as soon as we met. It's Paul O'Malley. And I think one of the most open people you're going to experience on a podcast. So hopefully we're going to get some really interesting stuff out of this. So Paul is the COO of Fox Agency. And Paul, well, tell us what that means and a little bit about the company, what you do.
Yeah, well, first of all, really amazing to be in this space with you, Andy. It's such a thrill. Yeah, I run Fox's US operation. So Fox Agency has been it's a creative led agency integrated across different offerings. They've been around for a long time, well, 13 years or so, but grand designs on conquering the US market. And they were doing a great job of expanding into the US from a European base. But I came on board back end of last year to help drive that on.
And it's not the first time you've done that sort of role, is it? Because that is not an American accent.
It's not an American accent, no. It's very astute of you to notice that.
That's what authors have, the power of observation. That's what...
I've noticed that. It's definitely a level above anybody else I've spoken to. So I was born and raised in Ireland. I left Ireland when I was 21 years old, and that's now 22 years ago. So I'm longer out of Ireland than I was in Ireland. And I was in England for 14 years, where I worked at a variety of different agencies. Mediacom probably being the most well-known one, but independent agencies. And I joined a company in 2014 called Kingpin Communications. And again, very similar to Fox Agency, they were in that space where they had reached a certain amount of growth in the UK, and they didn't necessarily have a plan to expand into the US. They just had a plan to expand. And so I helped a year of that in the UK, and then wasn't a eureka idea, let's expand into the US, but I took that sort of role on, moved over to San Francisco in 2016, and we had a great period of growth for 5 years, and then sold the business in 2021. And I stuck around for a year as it was acquired by the new agency. But once my time had come, I felt that it was a good time for me to take a step away. So I actually took a year out, and then waited for the right moment to come back around, and that ultimately ended up being Fox.
And the reason I mention that is because I think there's a particular challenge to trailblazing, to taking a business from one country to another, to establishing it on a new continent, or in a new vertical even, or whichever, but in your space, a new geography. And that brings with it a lot of pressure. And I think what's interesting is that that you've had the resilience to do that, and you've gone right through the process from beginning to sale, and then being prepared to set off and do it all again, and 4 months into another run at it, which is quite interesting. I'm definitely going to probe a little bit around that and see why on earth you've done it again, and how you're dealing with it, because there must be some tactics. But just sort of say before we jump on any further, for anyone who's new to the podcast, an emotional overdraft as we discuss it in relation to business, is the price that a leader, founder, entrepreneur pays, or the subsidy they pay for the success of their business, but it's the subsidy they pay through their own physical or mental well-being. And so that's the idea of you are subsidizing the success of your business at your own personal cost with your mental or physical well-being. And the measure of emotional overdraft that we'll talk about regularly here is your resilience. And so when you're in an emotional overdraft, your resilience is depleting all the time, and that's why it's a dangerous place to be. So that's really the concept of emotional overdraft that we'll be talking about. And Paul's got some interesting observations about it. So it's just worth contextualizing. I talked right across you. Bad host.
That's it. That's all right. I have the scars to show for it. So I can definitely give you some warts and all lie on the wall stuff.
So let's jump straight into it then. You are famous now for your post on LinkedIn where you talked about. I don't think you called it emotional overdraft, but it that's what it was. You spoke very openly about the challenges you'd had in being as successful as you have been. What made you? What was behind that? And maybe tell us a little bit of that story if you can.
When I first moved to the States, I had no experience in this market, no experience of growing a business. All I had was some anecdotal stories of what other agencies had done and perhaps maybe failed at. There were a handful of agencies just like Kingpin that had come over and shut up shop after a year because it wasn't working for them. They weren't making money, or they didn't want to support the person that had gone over. And I had relocated with my newly onboarded wife. That sounds weird? I onboarded her. I hired her and then basically forced her to marry me. Now, we got married like 6 months before we moved to the States. So, there's a period of settling into that new moment in your life, but also then shifting to a different continent, but shifting to the other side of the continent. And the one thing that my brother had told me, because my brother made a similar move worked for IDG for a long time, now Foundry, and he had shifted from London to San Francisco back in 2003. And he said to me at the time, the biggest thing that he found challenging was time zone back to home. Wasn't necessarily the doing business bit. And again, it was a different scenario for him because he was going to an established company, an established team. But for me, I was thinking, well, we're going to 8 time zones away from London and 10 time zones away from where my wife is from, which is Romania. And how are we going to deal with that in moments when we're trying to make friends, or we're trying to, like the business side of it, I almost compartmentalize as something that'll just be what it is. And in approaching it like that, I think the mistake that I made was I never wanted to apply any of the pressure that I was feeling from a work perspective onto my wife, because it was a big move for her as well. And I didn't want her to feel at any stage that I had made, we made the decision to go together. So it's not me making a decision of that, but I also didn't want to feel like I'd uprooted her for this opportunity and it wasn't going well. So I shielded basically everything from a work perspective away from her. And I focused with her on settling in San Francisco and meeting people and all of that sort of stuff. And for about a year and a half, I didn't hire anybody for the first year and a half. I basically took it upon myself to say, again, with support from team in London, particularly the owner of the business, a guy called Mirza, who was incredibly supportive, as were a handful of others, of course. But I generally very quickly established that if if I want to get things done at the speed that I want to get them done at, I have to do everything myself. Because I'm communicating with the UK team, let's say if an opportunity comes around, which was rare in the first 5-6 months. If any opportunities came around, I might send something out, and then maybe there was a situation where they would look at it coming through and they would be like, okay, well, I've got 8 hours before that guy comes online, so I can push this to the end of the day, get on with the stuff that actually I've been employed to do, which is focus on the European stuff, not focus on the US stuff. And then I get to the end of the day and they might, oh God, I forgot I meant to respond to Paul about that thing. So they blast something out, then they're gone. And then I would get something back that maybe was a watered down version of what I needed. And then I couldn't get a response for another 12 hours, maybe. So very quickly in the early part of that, I was like, well, I've got to be, the sales guy. I've got to be the BDR. I've got to be, the office manager. I've got to make the tea. I got to do everything here from start to finish and not really be able to rely on anybody else. And that was a mistake in one sense, but also it was I had developed a mentality of I don't want to be like the anecdotal stories, whether they're true or not, of other agencies not being successful. I can't go back to the UK with my tail between my legs.
Mm-hmm.
I can't be a failure in this. And so in doing that, I end up getting out of bed in the morning with no work to do, just creating work. I would send emails out to or make phone calls to prospects, no responses. But rather than think, well, they don't want to respond to me, it's not me and it's not Kingpin's offering. I always think about this scene from the movie Tin Cup with Kevin Costner, where he's just like this golfer guy who has all the ability, but there's something screwy going on in his head. And at a certain point in the movie, he has the shanks. So he's hitting the ball and they're just all going off to the side. And his coach says to him, take the change out of your right pocket and put it in your left pocket. And all of a sudden, it just gets him thinking, oh, that was the issue. I did that. Like, first 6 months, I deleted all my social stuff. I wasn't really that involved, but I was looking at a number of different ways that were potentially distracting me.
Mm-hmm.
All for this idea that I cannot fail doing this. And I must shield it from my wife. And yeah, it was huge amount of learning in that process that ultimately I think I paid for later on. The success of the business came, but I paid for it in other ways.
And that is the exact definition of an emotional overdraft, isn't it? That you sucked it up, you took it on, you had to do everything yourself. So that's a classic driver of an emotional overdraft, the feeling, and it's a startup effectively, albeit you're part of a bigger business. So you feel you've got to do all these things and there's no alternative. And maybe you feel the responsibility, even if it wasn't your sole decision that you moved to the States. So you then, if it's your responsibility, you've got to protect her from any other ramifications. And in doing so, you cut off a vital part of your support network.
Yeah, and
the
you know
only
what?
bit of it on the ground in the country with you.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm human, so I had moments in that, particularly in that first year, where I really considered throwing the towel in. And you often hear about this stuff, like, just keep going, keep persevering, and eventually you'll turn the corner. But there's no definitive amount of time that's going to take. That could happen in the first 2 weeks, or that could happen, it could take 2 years for that to happen. And so having that resilience to be able to withstand disappointment after disappointment, and disappointment in this case is just like, you pitch for something, you don't get it. And in my case, like, I was pitching for things that were like $5,000 entry, $10,000 entry. I remember the first time that I got $10,000 from a client, which, by the way, $10,000 was not for the agency. Maybe $2,000 of it. Actually, that's even too much. There's probably about $1,000 would have been the agency fee. So $10,000. It's not going to pay anything. It's not going to pay the wages that I've already accrued over the last whatever amount of months it's been, or, make me feel psychologically better that I'm starting to recoup some of the investment that's been put into the business, the investment that we've put into a very expensive place to live, all of that sort of stuff. There were moments when I'm like, I just don't know that I can do this. And I remember having a conversation with another company in the States that were like, we would be interested in taking you on and taking you on your visa. Spoiler alert, Mirza, if he's watching this. And I thought, okay, I'm gonna do that because I was telling myself I want to feel part of a team, but it's not even part of a team. I want to feel like I'm not the one that's solely responsible for everything. But the problem I had then was that company said to me, we can take your visa on, but that process is going to take 6 to 8 months. So I'm like, okay, I'm in this. I'm like 6 to 8 months. I don't know if I can do this for another 6 to 8 months. But then something changed in my head and I realized I thought about it as being trapped. I feel like I'm trapped here. And the only option for me to get out of being trapped is to literally quit and go back to the UK. And that is not an option for me. And it was that mentality shift that ultimately, I don't know, found more resilience and allowed me to then push through. And then when I started, almost as soon as I made that decision, I had a client who, I changed my mentality. She got in touch with me and she had like, again, $5,000 and she wanted to do something with $5,000. And I was just at that point where I was like, this is not going to work. What you're asking for, it's not even that you're not spending enough money. It's just that your expectations are not going to be aligned to what's possible. And she said, that's exactly what I wanted to hear. So here's $25,000 and let's do something different. And I was like, $25,000? Oh my God. And then that $25,000 turned into $100,000, turned into $300,000 in the space of 2 months. And then I had 2 more quarters of that and one another client at the same time. And then all of a sudden, overnight, I'm like making decisions about what office space do we need. I need to hire. And one of the things, and if you don't mind me mentioning your book, because you actually mention it in here as one of the things is that and I'm still doing this, and I think my wife does this in her personal life. So actually it's very relatable, but it's recognizing the victories when they come along and actually celebrating those moments. And we don't do that because our mentality...
Humans are shockingly bad at it.
Yeah, we have a tendency of kind of saying, oh, it's great that I've got this opportunity. Oh my God, if that comes through, it's so amazing. And then almost instantly flick into, but how am I actually going to deliver that? Or how am I going to do that as well as that? And throughout the whole period, it's just forgetting the fact that, hey, by the way, you got it. You got that moment. And you talked about a couple of founders that made the decision that when somebody would go to them and say, I've heard you do great work, I'd love to work for you, that would be their celebratory moment. And I just said it to my colleague here the other day. We're on the cusp of signing off something that's huge for Fox Agency. Huge in a few different ways, but it's a groundbreaking moment for Fox Agency in the US. And I said, as soon as that signs off, that's it. We're downing tools and we're going to go and celebrate it. And we're going to at least take the afternoon to recognize it. Because once we get into the weeds of this stuff, we'll forget all about it.
That's totally right. And once, as you say, it's not even just the build up to it. Once the moment happens, we're then busy in, well, how are we going to do it? How will we deliver it? How are we going to execute that? What resources do we need? We don't stop and celebrate. And you're right, those two guys, they built their business and they built an amazingly successful business around employing amazing people. They said, we just want the best people to come and work here and the clients will follow. If we're doing the best work, the clients will come and find us. And they got that right. They promised themselves. It took 2 years and someone came and knocked on their door and said, I think you're doing incredible work. I'd love to work for you. And here's my very impressive CV. And as they promised themselves, they shut the agency down. They took everyone they'd employed at that point who they'd gone and found rather than had come and found them. and they went downstairs across the road into the pub, and they spent the rest of the afternoon just celebrating that moment, which
And why not?
didn't even matter that they didn't. Well, I don't know if they employed the person, but that wasn't the point. Someone had knocked on the door and said, "You do amazing work. I'm an expert in my space. I'd love to work with you."
Yeah.
They knew they'd hit that milestone, and they recognized it, and they were really good at that. And I know why we don't celebrate those successes, because the way we avoided the saber-toothed tiger was by being always looking out for the next catastrophe that was about to happen. We didn't go, "Hey, look, we avoided that saber-toothed tiger," as some mammoth comes and stands on our head. You always had to be looking out, and we're hardwired. We're not very far from the caveman. We're really not from a time perspective. So it's critical to do that. But I'm just going to roll back. Thank you for sharing that story, and thank you for mentioning the book, because hey, it's here, and do buy the book. And by the way, Mirza was the first person that got in touch with me when I told him I was publishing a book, and he said, "When you publish it, Andy, I'd like a signed copy, please."
Yeah. He's a
Cheap
great guy.
bastard. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And now that he'll listen to this, he'll probably say, "Oh, it sounds like Paul's got a copy of the book. I'll just get it from him."
Yeah, exactly. But what you said was interesting. I'd like to ask you two things. One is how you felt when you were in that state where you felt you couldn't let anybody down and you had to take it all on yourself, and how that what the emotional overdraft. You were deep in an emotional overdraft, clearly, and handling that, what that made you feel, but also to then look at that, what I'd call a reframing, because nothing actually changed. You just saw the world in a different way. You framed it in a different way, and that somehow was a tipping point for you. So we'll come and talk about that in a minute, because that's what we talk about all the time. This is getting out of an emotional overdraft can happen as quickly as you get into it. It can be instantaneous if you reframe in the right way, if you delegate in the right way, if you make a decision, do something different, if you behave differently. It's the whole concept is about behavior. But just take us back a second, because I think a lot of people can relate to what you're saying, if not the specifics of your circumstance, but that feeling of taking it all on yourself and not allowing ourselves to fail, and not wanting anyone else to have to deal with it because we feel it's our job to protect them. What was the impact of that emotional overdraft on you? Are you happy to share that?
Yeah, for sure. And again, I think probably I didn't realize the impacts for another 3 years. So it's very easy for us to kind of look back at these situations and say, well, the tipping point was that I arrived at that moment where I realized the only way for me to move is to move forward. So there's no point in me thinking of escape plans or anything like that. I'm in this, I can't fail. And that we can frame as that's positive. Anybody in any walk of life, the best, like if you're writing a book, for example, often the things they will talk about in relation to writing a book is just, if you hit writer's block, just keep writing. Write, journal, do whatever, just force the habit, keep moving forward, and eventually then, you'll start to move things in the right direction. So it's very easy to kind of look at it and say, yeah, that's great. You did that. You got through that period of time that was difficult. Yeah, and everybody will relate to the fact that setting up something is hard. But, often then the thing is, well, once you see staff coming in and once you see business coming in, it's all rosy then after that, right? Not in my head. In my head, it was like, as soon as I hired my first staff member, I'm like, I have to protect that staff member. I've got to make sure that the money is coming in to be able to pay the salary. Not only pay the salary, but actually create a career path for people who are coming to an agency that didn't exist here a year ago. Why would they want to come here versus maybe somebody established company, yada, yada? We can't necessarily afford to do those things. So I have to create ways in which people feel valued, feel like they belong here, and get them to stay, and get our clients to feel like that, you've hired the best people and you take care of our business. And all of that stuff then kept me awake at night. It became, win a piece of business, I got to win another piece of business in order to protect that piece of business. and so on and so forth. And just keep doing that, rinse and repeat, just creating a thicker safety net.
So that's remorseless, isn't it?
Yeah. And then the agency, so Kingpin then gets to a point where you fast forward a number of years and we're doing really well. You know, we're ranking, we were doing an annual benchmarking report with B2B marketing, and we were consistently ranked as, we were always on the fastest list, but you know, fastest list is, I go from 1 to 3 people and I'm probably top of the fastest list. But in terms of all agencies that, you know, were at least entering into this thing, we were consistently ranking top 20, which again is a nice mark of the growth that you can see visually written down against other companies. And then we got to a position of we were approached and we were going to sell, and everything feels like we've succeeded. And then one morning I woke up and I was just eating breakfast. Nothing major was going on. There was no client issue. There was no tangible stress element that I could point to. And I started to feel like something was overcoming me. And I was eating breakfast and I stopped mid-sentence and I'm looking at my wife and she's looking at me and she's like, "You okay?" And it almost feels like an acid reflux thing, but not acidic. And just like my chest is starting to cave. I thought I was having a heart attack, and it lasted for about a minute, and it stopped. And I was like, I was freaked out. I didn't know what that was. And then it came again, and it came in waves every 5-10 minutes for the next hour and a half. And I was scared, and I went to the doctor, and this happened severely like this. I went to the doctor. I had ECGs or EKGs, they call them here. I don't know why they shifted. I had a stress test monitor attached to see whether, you know, again, I had any irregular heart issues, and nothing came up. And doctor told me then, you're having panic attacks. And I was like, "There's no way I'm having panic attacks. There's no way, because I'm in control." As in, what's going on? I live in New York City. I'd moved from San Francisco at this point. I live in New York City. I'm not struggling, you know. I'm not wondering where my next paycheck's going to come from. I'm not concerned for the team. The business is stable. My wife is working. She's happy. How could I be having panic attacks? And I didn't want to believe it, and so I didn't do anything about it other than just learned to accept that this was going to happen to me. And so for 4 months solid, I would have at least for an hour a day. And usually it sat into an hour. So every 5 minutes over an hour period. And I couldn't figure out what would trigger it. I started having these things, and I was just like, I would be in the middle of a meeting, for example, and I would just go quiet, maybe put my hands to my face, because I'd learned how to not react when it was happening, and understand that this is going to go away in like 30 seconds, a minute, and then just get on with it. And so people didn't even know I was having panic attacks right in front of them. And then there was a tipping point with that, where the panic attacks started to come while I was sleeping. So I would get them during the night. And that was a scary moment the first time it happened, because then again, you could think back to, this is a potential heart attack that's coming along. I was getting I already had a restlessness in my legs, but it started to feel like I was getting a buzzing under my skin, which just, all I could describe it was, it just felt like I could feel my blood flowing throughout my body. And that would get more and more intense as the weeks went by, to a point where tapping on the keyboard or listening to classical music, like again, I couldn't listen to music that had words in it, because I could feel basically everything that was happening. I remember sitting in a Starbucks here in New York, and I had headphones on. The headphones like these, noise cancelling headphones over the year, nothing playing, just on to try and block out the noise as much as possible. And I was looking at people walking and I could feel the footsteps. I had lost control completely of my physical, um, everything. And then my mind was going with that as well. My mind was going into places like I can't deal with this, and I don't want to deal with this, and I don't want my life to be like this. But I still was denying the fact that it was panic or stress, or that I'd gone so far into an emotional overdraft that I'd lost control of myself. And so I went to London, and I think the biggest moment for me in that period of time was I was walking through Hatton Gardens, where an old office of mine used to be. I was in between meetings, and it was a beautiful morning, and I'd just come from meeting an old colleague of mine, and I stood at a set of traffic lights at the corner of Charing Cross and Hatton Gardens there, and I started to feel a panic attack coming on. And I looked to the side and I saw this double-decker bus at the traffic lights. And just as I turned my head back, all of a sudden everything just went, I blacked out, but I managed to turn myself away from the road so that I was lucky I didn't kind of fall into the road. I fell into a wall. Nobody came over, by the way. It's 11 o'clock in the morning. This guy's falling at the side of the road. Nobody came near me. Maybe they looked at the beard and they thought, this guy's homeless. But it was a scary moment because it was now the first time that the panic attacks had taken on a different form. And that form was, now you're blacking out. And now I was stood on the side of the street on the phone. I'd called Mirza. Mirza was telling me to go to a hospital. I didn't want to do that. I basically got myself back to a hotel, and I cancelled meetings for the next few days, and I stayed in the hotel for 2 days until I got to the airport to go back to the States. Yeah. And then, ultimately when I got back to the States, my drinking was the only thing that was stopping me from feeling the panic attacks during the night. So then my drinking habits got to a point of I was almost self-medicating myself with alcohol. So then I was starting to drink to a point where, like, I would work to the day and I would get to whatever time it was, 4:35, and I would open a bottle of wine and I would pour it. My Mac laptop, aired wine, gave a thumbs up. I would be through a bottle of wine by 6:30, which again is still early in the evening. You just open a second bottle of wine, and then you just, all of a sudden you realize that you're not going to sleep naturally. You're drinking to the point of blacking out, and then trying to operate normally the next day, but with the same panic attack situation and the same self-medication with alcohol. So obviously that was a huge issue. And an issue then that a long story short, succumbed to the advice of the doctors and started to take antidepressants. And the thing that actually helped me get there, which I think is important for people to hear, is that I had been told for so long that antidepressants are going to alter your personality, or you're going to become so you're going to need them so much,
so dependent.
You're so dependent on them that you're not going to be able to ever come off them. And none of that's true. And the thing that changed it for me was the doctor basically saying, your body is made up of chemicals. And you've allowed, for whatever situation, we can kind of pick that apart, or a psychologist and a therapist pick that apart. But your chemicals are imbalanced. And so this is just something that will help realign your chemicals. And that's it. It's not a, something that's just going to paper over the cracks and you're still suffering underneath. It's something to help you realign. And it wasn't a quick fix. I think the first week I put a lot of pressure on it working and actually went into such a dark place that I genuinely thought, I just don't want to be here anymore. And that was a scary
Horrible.
moment. Yeah, because again, it's like one of those things where I've done CBT in the past, I've done therapy, and they ask you to fill out forms, and in that form they were like, "Hey, have you thoughts of self-harm? Have you thoughts of any of that?" And I'm like, definitely not.
Not that
Like,
guy.
I'm not that guy. There's no way that I'll ever be that guy. Yeah, whatever issues I have are probably just, I need to find some psych tricks to fix. And then all of a sudden, it was upon me. And I think I would have filled that form out and said no, because that's what I feel like most people will probably say in that situation. It's not that I'm in denial of it. It's just that I don't want to admit to it. But in that moment, it was the single scariest moment that I'd had. But I will say, the next day, once I'd kind of come off the other side of that, I felt stronger for it. I felt that I had conquered the darkest moment and come off the other side of it, and actually, with that mentality, and then the antidepressants helping to kick in, and very, very key to it all, alcohol is a depressant, and I gave that up. And so the combination of those things, and all of a sudden life just became very, very different. Very different. That's in a nutshell. And I'm still
Well,
here.
and we're glad you're still here, of course. And it's horrible to hear that, and that you had to go through that. But thank you for sharing it. That's very generous. And I think whatever, in so many ways, people will hear that, and I hope people are listening and being able to take something from it. Just from that story, it's really important. And I didn't know that we would definitely go through that, but thank you for sharing that. That was generous.
I think it's important for people in general to understand that to look after your mental health is something that needs conscious care. You need to really think about making the space for yourself. We often hear this thing about, like, you can't love anybody else if you don't love yourself. And it's like, yeah, get it. Everything sounds like a cliche and whatever, but there's so much truth in again, making space for resilience and recovery. And you talk about it in relation to that recharging, and how we frame the idea of recharging, and how going for a walk or taking time out watching TV or spending time with your loved ones, we don't frame it as the positive, the elements that we need to inject positivity back into our lives. We frame it we don't even frame it, I don't think. I think, and it's difficult. I guess if you're a business leader, it's hard to switch off. You might find that you're in those moments and you're still thinking about work, and you have to make a conscious effort to, I'm going to check out on the weekend. I'm going to check out after 5:30 in the evening, and I'm going to discipline myself to not look at my phone, or to not get involved. But we don't do that.
And it's
we
so
say,
hard.
if you need anything,
yeah. There's a lot of clever tech that is all designed to keep you locked in and stuck on it. That we are a lot of us are people pleasers. You had that kind of need to do everything yourself, which meant you were always on. So that the always on nature of these.
Yeah,
brilliant invention, the best and the worst invention ever. I'm waving my phone around right now. You cannot unplug, and the irony of that is that you are never really away from it. You're never away from it. And that's whatever you think. I'm just going to check in. I have clients who say, I just do 1 hour each morning when I'm on holiday. Well, so that's your day. You worked that day. That day's gone. You're not unplugging. The irony of that analogy is that, of course, what I talk about in the book, I think, is like electric cars. Do I mention electric cars? I think so. I'm going to write the damn thing. But it would be madness to drive your electric car the 180 miles or whatever the range of an electric car is, and then it stops, but just to insist that it carries on. Yeah, okay, I need to go 220 miles today, so I insist you just keep going, car, and do 40 more miles. You would be carted off, because it's a nonsense, and we laugh at it and go, that's ridiculous. Your phone dies because you haven't charged the battery. You can't insist the phone's going to just make one more call.
Yeah.
It can't. You have to plug it back in and recharge it. And we are just the same. And if we don't plug back in, if we don't recharge, if we don't find the ways of addressing that, what ultimately happens, you said, I lost control. In fact, you said I lost control of my body, I think is what you said. But effectively, you lost control. So at some point, the electric car, the mobile phone, the human will stop. And you then no longer have any governance over that. You have no control over that. The body is going to do what it's going to do. And where you got to is a very extreme place. But I think a lot of people are, in business and not in business, are very close to that a lot of the time. Overwhelm, stress, burnout. Yeah, I mean, the versions and flavors of those things where people have convinced themselves that's the normal place to be. It's not a normal place to be, and it's not inevitable, and it doesn't have to happen. It really doesn't. And what's interesting, I was thinking when you just mentioned going for a walk or finding your cooking, or for me, I know when I'm cooking, that means cooking doesn't make me in a better place, but I know that when I'm in a good place, I love cooking. So if I'm cooking, I know that my head's in a good place. But when I talk to clients, we have a weekly catch-up call, and we deliberately have no agenda. It's just an hour. But quite often at the end of those calls, we have maybe spoken about something important, maybe not spoken about something important. But I always check in and say, how do you feel? How was that? Was it valuable? And they go, I just feel better. I feel better for having said it out loud. I feel better for having taken some time out and not had to fix everything, or not be at everyone else's beck and call, or not have to deal with clients, or not have to tell my wife that we're not getting a bonus, or I just feel better for having stepped outside of it and had a conversation. And that's the thing about emotional overdraft. I think it is about behavior change. You don't need all the business books. You just need, my publisher hates me every time I say this, you don't need to buy the book. There's lots of good stuff in there that's very helpful, but just knowing that this thing is called emotional overdraft, that you're trading in an overdraft, recognizing that is enough for a lot of people, a lot of the time, to just stop you and maybe get you to consider doing something differently. Just knowing it has a name and it's a thing, and giving yourself permission to recognize it as something might stop someone getting as deeply into that emotional overdraft as they otherwise might.
It's creating a habit for that. Like I say, you have to first accept that it's a thing. And then if you accept that it's a thing, then at least you're conscious about it. But then the next step after that is to create a plan for how you are going to actively look after it, and then follow through on the plan. And it's a weird thing, because if you kind of treat it like a business, you probably achieve that. Because we're used to creating plans and following through and doing whatever is necessary in order for that plan to work.
And it is. Sorry, you go on. Even if it's.
Yeah, even if that means changing the plan, but at least there's still this idea of continuing to. I've got to find a path to move forward. If that path is blocked, I'm going to find another path. But I'm going to move forward, regardless. But there's an irony in the fact that all this technology that you talk about actually is a blueprint for how we should treat ourselves. As you said, the phone will eventually run out of power and has to recharge.
Yep.
It's only humans that will run out of power and then think that we can continue going on. Everything else that is causing us this frustration of feeling that we need to be on all the time has their moment of recharge.
Yeah.
Bizarre.
And it's And it's such an important thought to take away. And I wish I'd thought of it when I wrote the book, because it's not in the book. But it's a lovely thought, Paul. And that's why I love these conversations, because exploring this thing, there's so far to take emotional overdraft as an idea. I think I want people to take this idea on. But the idea that if you feel yourself, think of the absurdity of insisting that your mobile phone gives you one more call, even though it's zero battery. Just of having that conversation with it, or of sitting in your car that's run out of gas or electricity or whatever, and going, okay, but just give me 10 more miles.
Yeah.
Is so ridiculous. And yet we do that to ourselves. And take that idea away. Everyone who's listening to this, take that idea away and think of that when you are insisting, when you aren't being kind to yourself, when you're taking too much on, where you're JFDIing. So we talk in the book about these 10 drivers of the 10 behaviors which will lead us towards emotional overdraft. And you can go online and explore those things at emotionaloverdraft.com. I don't mean to plug it. I think it's a useful thing to go and do. You can do some self-assessment for free online. But look at those drivers, and if you find yourself, if you hear your internal voice saying, just push through, I'm just going to do that, I'm going to take that on. I had a client who wouldn't take holidays because his staff all had kids. So he would let them have the holiday time off so that they could spend the time with their kids. He had kids. He had kids. And when we spoke about it, he was getting very frustrated, and we spoke about it, and I said, well, go and ask your team what they think of this. And he said to them, this is what I do, this is why I do it. How would you feel if I took some time off? They went, take some time off. We want you to do that. We want you to do that, because when you spend time with your kids, you come back charged up, full of energy, with loads of ideas and great stories and stupid photos. So look for that moment. Look for that moment when you are insisting that you carry on, when patently the batteries run flat. Learn to spot them. That's the habit I think Paul's talking about. Get into the habit of spotting. I mean, do it before then, obviously. Try and do it before then. But if you have ground to a halt, recognize you've ground to a halt and do something about it.
There's another thing that I always tell myself now. Again, something that I didn't really think about too much, although I'd read it in books. Many books of you should always remember that you live in the moment. Like, it's so difficult to do that, but there is this thing that we do as humans. So we live in two places. We live in the past and we live in the future. And the past informs behavior, and the future makes us afraid of outcomes, potential outcomes. And as a result of not living in the present and spending our time in those two places, we can cripple ourselves in so many ways. And again, you just gave an example of it, the guy who's thinking about, if I take vacation, how's that going to look to my team? Or I'm being generous to my team because that's going to be something that's going to make them happier. And again, I have been there. I've foregone bonuses for 8 years to give to my team. Is that going to make them happier in their work? Yeah, they'll be happy when they get a bonus, but the happiness it's not because of the bonus. Because the bonus comes through in a paycheck, and they've forgotten about it a week later. It's everything that goes on throughout the year that they're thinking about, and it's not going to stop them from finding another job potentially. They're still on a career path. But you take so much fear on of what happens if I do that, it's going to do that. That woman that you mentioned in the book that was I can't let that guy go because he gets on well with other people, but he's a nightmare for the business. But if I let him go, it's going to impact all those people. And then she does let him go, and they're like, I can't believe he lasted
so long. What took you so long? Yeah.
So it's, again, this idea that we're crippled by the fear of what if. What if I'm a failure? What if I lose that person? What if I lose that client? it's again going back to this idea of like not celebrating positive moments when they happen, because I'm already in the future, because maybe I remember losing a client in the past. There's just so much going on where we're doing this back and forth business, and not actually thinking, right, well, what's the issue at hand right now, and how can I deal with that? But conversely, how can I look after myself?
And what I do talk about in the book is the three principles, and there's a lot of stuff to talk about here, but I won't go into the detail of it. But the reason you need to stay in the present is because that is the reality you're experiencing in that moment. You're talking about the future reality that you're creating, which hasn't happened yet, and the past reality is your interpretation of what's happened.
Right.
All of that is created in your own brain. Your experience of the past and your thinking about the future is created in your own brain in that moment. And we create it. And it's such an easy thing to say and such a difficult thing to grasp. So what I say is the amazing Rena Loizu, who's a quality of mind coach I worked with, astonishing insights into the world. But she said to me that your feelings are a measure of the quality of your thinking. Your thinking is creating your feelings. Your feelings then create your behaviors. So your brain creates a reaction, which is, say, anger. And then with the anger, you might strike out at someone. You might argue with your partner. You might shout at a client. You might smack your kid. I don't know what it is, and that behavior drives the outcomes. So your thinking drives your feelings, which dictates the behavior, which dictates your outcomes. It all comes from your brain. This is your point about, be in the now, because you are creating that now for yourself. I know it sounds woo-woo. It sounds a bit conceptual, but it's true. And if you just take one thing away from this little diatribe, it's your feelings are a brilliant measure of the quality of your thinking. So if you feel yourself getting frustrated, if you feel yourself getting stressed, if you feel yourself getting angry, and Brené Brown, the amazing Brené Brown, not a relative, has written a book called Atlas of the Heart. There's 87 different emotions she defines in this book, and it's so useful to have the words for it, because if you have the words for it, then you can more easily recognize it. But look for those feelings, and if those feelings are happening, they should be the cue for you to stop and take a moment and recognize, well, what's my thinking doing that's causing me to feel these emotions or these feelings? That's how you can actually, in the moment, start to self-regulate and recognize what's going on. How you deal with it, obviously, is no simple matter. And there's 1,000 ways, million ways, infinite number of ways to deal with those things. But simply noticing your feelings and giving pause and thinking, well, what thinking is creating that is immensely powerful.
Yeah, and I think, again, just to say, because that there's no one way to do it, and there's a different way for everybody, but the starting point is recognizing that it's a thing.
Yeah,
and if you recognize the thing, then you create the path.
Yeah, and that's the guy that was not taking his vacation, that and letting other people take it, over empathizing. And people can't believe that empathy is a bad thing, but you can over empathize. It can be a very unhelpful behavior for you personally or for your family. In some moments, he was feeling frustrated that he couldn't take his holiday. He recognized it. It might have been the right thing to do. It might have been the right thing for him to pick it up and shoulder that burden and let the others have the holiday. Another time, it might not be the right thing to do. So there's no prescription here. There's no right answer. There's, I don't know, 200 pages in the 250 pages of the book giving you some ideas of things that you can do in those moments. But there's no right or wrong. And the following day or the following minute, another solution might be the right solution. But the absolute key is to recognize it in the moment. And that's about kindness. I think that's about being kind to yourself, being fair to yourself, and giving yourself a moment to just recognize what's going on in you. Recognize that your battery is running down, and that it's okay. That's normal, and doing something about it rather than just insisting
Absolutely.
that you keep going.
And I don't know how much time we have left, but there's a happy ending that I wanted to share. Is that when I left, when the Kingpin was taken over by the marketing practice, and I left at the end of 2022, I bought a camera. I'd always had a particular interest in photography, but never really active. And I needed something I felt to distract myself from leaving people behind. Because that's kind of, I was, worried about, again, people thinking that I was thrown in the cell, which I was to some degree, but but it was, again, from a position of, I need to take this moment for myself. I've been through a rough time, come out the other side of it. So I took some time off, and I threw myself into photography. And I did course after course. I learned everything that there was to learn about the inside of the camera, so that I could shoot manually. And last year I had photographs in over 20 exhibitions and 2 solo shows in New York. And I did not, and it's not a humble brag or anything like that, but it's to say that I gave so much time to fear thinking that I crippled myself from doing anything else. And I did not realize that in just allowing time for myself to explore things that actually were a passion, that I would have the capacity to A, do it, and B, be somewhat successful at it. And I'm now a board member of the American Photographic Artists Society, which is also a nuts thing because, again, I've only been doing this for a year. I should tell them. But I did a lot, in that period of time that I realized that I had the capacity. I had so much more capacity for myself than I had ever given myself the opportunity to explore. And so now I'm back in the working world. I really am careful about balancing what's needed for business and making sure that I'm conscious about where I get my enjoyment, where I get my recovery time, and recognizing that.
Where you plug back in.
Exactly. Where I plug back in, where I charge myself.
And that's a brilliant close to that story. And that's kind of the point. This is about behavior, which is simple to change, but so hard to change. We are creatures of habit. And so on that note, and you may have already touched on it, I guess, but what we talk about is we ask our guests to share one simple change that they'd like to share with people listening, which they think could help some people reduce their emotional overdraft or not even get into an overdraft. Have you got something you can share with us?
Yeah. And I touch upon things that kind of ultimately result in bigger things, but I feel like it takes time to get there. So if I kind of go back to where I at least recognize the moments where I needed to take stock of my situation, and that was, I would go through a work week and go into the weekend feeling stressed, and so therefore not really allow myself to recuperate at the weekend and probably work at the weekend to try and feel like I was on top of things coming into Monday. So it's just a continuous cycle of never feeling like you're off. And so one of the changes that I made many years ago was that I would keep Friday completely clear of meetings. Absolutely no meetings on a Friday. Now, there's a caveat to it where I would, if somebody said to me, have you got 5 minutes to jump on an unplanned call, or I need to talk because I've got something going on, I'd like your advice, that's different. But if I looked at my calendar and I saw meeting after meeting after meeting, and I just like, where am I doing the work? Where am I stopping thinking about this? It's just an endless cycle of being in this kind of go mentality. So I cleared my calendar on Fridays, and that allowed me then to at least feel like I'm approaching Friday as a day for admin, for preparing myself to actually give myself a weekend. And then I was coming into the new week feeling like, it's a fresh go at a new week. That hugely changed. It seems like a very simple thing, but it hugely changed my thinking about how I was showing up for myself in days that I should have been showing up for myself, which is the days that you're not employed.
What a fabulous thought. I've got a question about it, which is, I think a lot of people listening might be going, love the principle of that. How do I protect it? Because I think lots of people do similar things, not necessarily as with the clarity that you did that, but they'll say, I'm not going to have any meetings on Tuesday morning. I'm just going to do, we talk about managing and maker work. I'm going to do maker work, creative work, writing. I'm not going to have any meetings on a Tuesday morning, and then one comes in, then two come in, and then it's gone. So how do you protect a Friday when you decide that's the day I'm not going to have meetings?
Well, first of all, it takes a lot of discipline.
From you, not from other people.
From me, yeah, because you have to have the ability to say no. Things come up. So I would start with try to get it. I'm not trying to overload. I'm also looking at Monday to Thursday, and you get to a point where you're like, does this meeting need to be an actual physical meeting? Do I need to give up an hour of my time for something? Is it going to be valuable to the person I'm talking to? Is it going to be valuable to me? Is it going to impact things that I could be doing in that time? If the answer is yes, I do need to have this meeting, then great. Can I have it in Monday to Thursday? So if something comes in that Thursday and I can't do it that day, can it wait till Monday? Or can it, that sort of thing. So protect Friday as much as
so often we don't ask that question, do we? We don't go, could it wait till Monday? We just go, no. Oh well, they're gonna like it if I say yes, so I'll say yes, and I'll sacrifice some of my theoretically protected Friday.
Yeah,
it's a form of saying no.
It is a form of saying no without it coming across as like the negative of saying no. But I'm look again. Anybody I've ever worked with, there's two principles that I generally tend to work by, and they're not eureka things, but I believe are the best ways for us to do the best work that we can do, and that's just managing expectations and managing deadlines, and everything else around that is nice to have. And I've often said, as when we worked as part of a media agency, we would lose out to agencies that were more creative in their pitches. And we would focus so much on what the client needs to do to get the results. And the client, in those moments, they want to see excitement. They want to see, shiny things. But ultimately, the stuff that we would have delivered would be the reason why they stick with us for a long time, because we're all about managing expectations and meeting deadlines. Now, obviously, I understand the blend of the two, but I still always come back to those two principles. The shiny stuff will win you the business. The managing expectations and meeting deadlines will keep you the business. And when it comes to managing expectations, that's not just managing expectations with your clients, it's with your colleagues. So if I want to keep Friday clear, I'm not afraid to tell people, this is why I do it. By the way, you should do it too. And so many of our clients actually employ this thing where they say, I don't do meetings on Fridays. Now, whatever reason they don't do it, good. I'm all here for that. But as soon as I start working with somebody who's like, okay, let's get a meeting in tomorrow to discuss the thing, I'm like, no. That's not how we're going to be able to protect ourselves. It's not how we're going to be able to get the best work out of each other, because we're going to be joining these things frustrated. We're going to be joining these things thinking about the things that we could be doing or should be doing or whatever. So it's about discipline, but it's also about openness to the idea and helping to enforce it as a positive thing for everybody.
So at a minimum, you're saying, make sure you tell people. Internally and externally, make sure you tell people, and don't just tell them, but tell them why.
Yeah.
Fabulous.
Transparency. That's it. It's not a bad thing to look after your mental health. And as a leader, you you cannot say to somebody, I care about your mental health, and then show them that you're not even looking after yours. It's this idea of like, I don't want you to work overtime. I don't want you here past 5:30. And then they look at you and they go, well, what are you doing? Because then they feel like, well, if the boss is sticking behind, I have to stick behind, You have to be disciplined with yourself first. Again, going back to this whole idea of like, you've got to love yourself before you can love others. And again, it's the same for business. You've got to lead by example in some of these cases.
We could keep doing this for a long time, Paul, and I wish we could. And we will. You and I will catch up another time. But that was so helpful, so insightful, and so incredibly generous. Paul, thank you very much.
Thanks, Andy. I appreciate it.
And breathe. It's very hard to write a summary or to record a summary for that conversation with Paul. I firstly want to say thank you so much for sharing that. At one level, I really hope that no one listening to this can relate to that, to what Paul told us. But I absolutely know that many of you will be able to relate to it in one way or another. I can, and I'm sure you can too. So thank you, Paul, for being so brave and so generous, and really for taking us into the detail of that, which is what really matters, I think, in here as well. So that was my first thought before we went anywhere else. Sometimes when I'm listening to a podcast, I find myself stopping it and making notes as I go. I have a suspicion that that's one that you probably listened to right through and didn't stop. I'd encourage you to go back and listen to it again. There's so much to take out from that, apart from what Paul went through and how he dealt with it, and so many good, strong ideas. This is probably one of those pods that's worth listening to again. And my other thought, actually, as we were recording it, but that I want to share now, is that you probably know people like Paul, people who are running businesses, people who are leading teams, entrepreneurs who have who appear to be fine, who appear to be doing well, who are thriving, highly successful, apparently enviable lives. But you probably more than they can see that perhaps they are trading deeply in their emotional overdraft, that perhaps they are almost kidding themselves or muscling their way through. If you think that, if you even suspect that, I really encourage you to talk with those people, talk with your friends, maybe point them to this podcast, just so they can listen, just so they can know, maybe get a better understanding about what they're dealing with. So, buy them Emotional Overdraft if you think that will help. But encourage people to come to this podcast, because if they're like Paul, they're not going to see it. The point he made about, if he did a survey with the therapist and tick all the boxes saying how well he's doing, that he didn't really couldn't even acknowledge that he wasn't. And I suppose that's the next point I would take out of this was, it's incredible, isn't it? The body knows how you're really doing. And Paul was sitting there having breakfast, and the body went, enough. We stop now. We stop. And that's that we have to listen to that. We have to listen to those messages, really, really listen to our bodies. Really listen to what's going on, so that we can tune into that. So that thought is to tune into, to use your feelings. That's why I talked about that. I don't normally talk that much in our podcast. I mean, I want my guests to share their stories, but I think use your feelings as a way of tuning into how well you're doing, and then go from there. Gosh, there were so many things that I could talk about, but I just want to pick out a few that are really worth reflecting on. He talked about taking things on himself and the idea of taking on more staff, and that rather than feeling that was growth and success and more opportunity, he felt it was more pressure and more responsibility. And a lot of people feel that way. And I think it's one to look out for. It's one of the many drivers, that feeling that you have to get it done. But it was a really good point, and only looking back and only reflecting back on it could Paul see that with any kind of level of clarity. So that's one to look out for in the moment. Particularly, I thought that was a specific example of something to think about. I don't think we really talked about this, but I think it was implicit in what we discussed, which is to get help. And we talk about, in the book, I talk about having a personal board and having people you can lean on. And Paul has got help with, therapy and so on. And coaching is definitely not therapy, by the way. They're not the same thing. They do different jobs. But it's so valuable to get help. It's so valuable and useful to get someone else's perspective, or even just take a moment, take some time out and discuss with someone how you're feeling or what you're dealing with, or just to say some things out loud. It doesn't even have to be with any kind of intention, just to take some time out and say it out loud to someone you trust or someone you like or someone you respect. I'd really encourage you to do that, but of course it could be therapy as well. It could be getting some professional help, and don't, if you can possibly avoid it, don't allow yourself to get to the point where Paul did. It's incredibly hard to spot, but we saw the absolute damage an emotional overdraft can do to an individual. And the last thing I wanted to think about was the recharging that we talked about. It really can feel in the moment that you just don't have time. You don't have time to go to the gym. You don't have time to go for that walk. You don't have that time to do some cooking, whatever your thing is. You don't have time to take half term off. You don't have time to do the things that bring you joy and plug you back in. The reality is you have no choice but to make that time. As we saw with Paul, if you don't, your body will tell you in the end, and you'll hit a wall in one way or another. So it's not optional. It's not a nice to do. It's something I'd really encourage you to do deliberately, and to do regularly and systematically, and make it part of your routine. And Paul touched on habit 2 or 3 times in the conversation. I think he was spot on. Get into the habit of doing these things. I know it may sound difficult in the moment. You're thinking, yeah, but I've got 1,000 things to do, Andy. What we've learned, if nothing else, from this is that in the end, your body will stop. It will stop you working. That's how bad. That's what burnout really is. That's what stress really is. That's what being overwhelmed really is. And you will have no choice. And leading up to that point, you will have been making all sorts of terrible decisions, all sorts of bad decision making. So build it in now and look after yourself, recharge yourself. Don't just shout at the phone and say one more call or one more mile to your electric car. Make the time to recharge in whatever way you need to recharge. I so strongly encourage it. It was such a great message to come from that conversation. I think you can tell I've been quite touched by this. And I am. I get emails from people all the time, and I hear about the damage that emotional overdraft can do to people. So please be kind to yourself, and try and take something from this podcast that will help you right now. And if you don't need it, share it with somebody else.